So, picture this. You wake up on the morning of June 8th, grab your phone, and your news feed is just absolutely on fire. Missiles flying over Israel, Iran firing back. A ceasefire that was supposed to finally bring some peace, completely shattered practically overnight. You've got Trump posting about an immediate ceasefire, Netanyahu firmly holding his ground, and Iran drawing these incredibly harsh red lines. It is, quite frankly, absolute geopolitical chaos. But underneath all that deafening noise, a very real, extremely high-stakes diplomatic puzzle is actually unfolding. Okay, let's dive into this, because today's explainer is going to cut right through the political spin and give you the clear, completely impartial context you need to understand what's really going on here.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. First, we'll cover how the war started. Then we'll look at the fragile ceasefire attempts, the Lebanon complication, the June collapse, and finally, the actual requirements for lasting peace. We're going to break down the timeline first, and then zoom out to look at the massive hurdle standing in the way of a real deal. Let's get right into it.
Now, if you're watching the news right now and thinking to yourself, wait a minute, didn't we already have a ceasefire? Didn't they literally just agree to stop? You are completely validated in that confusion. The sheer whiplash of broken truces and constantly shifting deadlines has been incredibly difficult to track. It's exhausting. But the reality is that stopping a hot war between two deeply entrenched, heavily armed nations isn't just about agreeing to put the weapons down. It's like a giant puzzle where you have to untangle decades of incredibly complex, conflicting strategic interests.
And the stakes for untangling that puzzle? Well, they literally could not be higher for the rest of us. Why? Because of one massive number. 20%. That is the rough estimate of the entire world's oil supply that passes straight through the Strait of Hormuz. When this conflict escalated, that vital choke point was abruptly closed, and it caused global energy markets and supply chains to just go completely haywire. So this isn't just some distant regional dispute. It's a massive crisis pulling the United States and honestly the entire global economy directly into the crossfire.
So let's start with Section 1, how the war started. Let's move to and see how this builds over time. Back in June 2025, Israel's 12-day war against Iranian facilities ended with a ceasefire that was brokered by the US and Qatar. But honestly, that was just a temporary pause button. None of the actual underlying issues were resolved. And that fragile pause violently broke on February 28, 2026, which ultimately forced mediators like Pakistan to scramble and try to put the pieces back together by April.
We really need to slow down here and emphasize the sheer gravity of what actually happened on that February 28th date. The US and Israel launched the absolute largest combat sortie in Israel's history, a highly coordinated assault using roughly 200 fighter jets. And in doing so, they assassinated Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. I mean, just think about that for a second. The man who had led Iran for over 3 decades was suddenly gone in a single night. This singular, unprecedented event fundamentally altered the entire calculus of the conflict, and it instantly triggered a massive Iranian retaliation.
As part of that massive retaliation, Iran didn't hold back. They launched hundreds of missiles and drones, directly striking US military bases in the region. But crucially, they also completely closed the Strait of Hormuz. By taking that specific step, Iran essentially dragged the United States and global energy markets right into the dead center of the crisis. When you're dealing with a full-scale war, a spiraling global shipping crisis, and the world's superpower now directly involved, well, finding any sort of diplomatic foothold becomes almost incredibly difficult.
Which naturally brings us to Section 2, fragile ceasefire attempts. In early March, the public face of all this diplomacy was basically playing out on social media. Former President Trump was out there demanding Iran's unconditional surrender, and he kept setting these shifting deadlines for a deal. First it was March 21st, then it moved to March 23rd, and then April 7th. Unsurprisingly, Iran pretty much just ignored these declarations. It really goes to show that unilateral demands rarely ever force a breakthrough when you're dealing with deeply entrenched sovereign nations.
Behind the scenes, however, a really surprising mediator actually stepped up to the plate. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif used his strategic relationships with both the West and the Islamic world to host talks over in Islamabad. And it worked. Briefly, it created this tiny window of hope where, on April 8th, a 2-week ceasefire was actually announced, built partly around a 10-point plan from Iran. But almost immediately, massive roadblocks popped right back up, heavily centered around the U.S. demanding the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
And one of the biggest underreported roadblocks is Section 3, the Lebanon complication.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact diplomatic deadlock happening right now.
Both sides have these absolute, non-negotiable red lines that are clashing directly in Lebanon. From Iran's view, Hezbollah is a core ally in its axis of resistance. If Iran signs a ceasefire deal while Hezbollah is actively being bombed, they're going to look incredibly weak back home. But from Israel's perspective, they maintain the absolute right to secure their northern border. There is no way they're going to let an Iranian ceasefire act as a convenient shield for Hezbollah to rearm.
To give you an idea of how active that front actually remained, just consider this number. According to Lebanon's Prime Minister, Nawaf Salam, Israel carried out nearly 3,500 airstrikes in Lebanon during that supposed truce period that began in April. That is a staggering figure. So, while the diplomats were shaking hands in quiet negotiating rooms, the ceasefire on the ground was violently fragmenting before it even truly got started.
Fast forward to the present day, Section 4, the June collapse.
The chain reaction of events over these specific 48 hours is just pure whiplash. On June 7th, Israel struck Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Deciding that a firm red line had been crossed, Iran fired missiles directly at Israel the very next day, on June 8th, which of course prompted an immediate Israeli response. Then, by June 9th, we get this incredibly fragile pause, with Trump once again taking to social media, promising total victory and a great deal in exactly 2 weeks.
But the rhetoric on the ground tells a completely different story about the stakes here. Listen to this. Iran's foreign minister publicly stated, "We employed only a fraction of our power, zero restraint if our infrastructure is struck again." Now compare that heavily escalating threat to Prime Minister Netanyahu's incredibly careful wording, where he stated he was halting attacks on Iran, but explicitly retained the absolute right to self-defense. Both sides are desperately trying to pause without giving up a single inch of leverage.
Because of all this intense, high-stakes posturing, skepticism is running incredibly high right now regarding any promises of a rapid peace deal within 2 weeks. After all, as we've already seen in this timeline, 2 weeks has been a constantly moving target for months. The underlying structural realities of a conflict this deep simply do not lend themselves to quick fixes.
So the crucial point is figuring out the difference between a temporary band-aid and an actual solution. Section 5. Requirements for lasting peace. For any sort of permanent resolution to happen, diplomats have to overcome 4 massive, deeply interconnected hurdles. First, they have to finally resolve the fate of Iran's nuclear program. Second, they absolutely must permanently and verifiably reopen the Straits of Hormuz. Third, they need to find a mutually acceptable arrangement regarding Iran's ballistic missiles and all its proxy networks across the Middle East. And finally, number 4, they must ensure domestic legitimacy for the leaders on both sides.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the absolute catch-22 surrounding the nuclear program. The U.S. is essentially demanding that Iran completely abandon its nuclear ambitions right in the middle of a hot war. But from Iran's perspective, having literally just suffered an unprecedented, massive bombing campaign that killed their leader, they view their nuclear capability and their proxy networks like the Houthis as their only remaining deterrents against any future attacks. It's a complete stalemate.
And that brings us to what is maybe the most human element of this entire geopolitical puzzle, the legitimacy trap. Because beyond all the military tactics and the grand strategy, the leaders on both sides are quite literally fighting for their political survival. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, absolutely cannot afford to sign any deal that looks like a surrender to his people. Conversely, Israel's leadership cannot agree to any terms that make it look like they just abandoned their core security objectives. Any successful deal absolutely has to allow both sides to go home and declare a victory.
But hey, despite the staggering complexity that makes peace look almost completely impossible, there are very real, very powerful incentives forcing all these parties to stay at the negotiating table. Iran's economy is completely devastated, and keeping that strait closed is really starting to alienate their few remaining allies. Meanwhile, the US and the broader global community are staring down the barrel of a massive supply chain and energy crisis. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, no party involved actually wants to be dragged into an indefinite, boundless war in the Middle East.
Which leaves us with this final, pressing question. Is lasting peace actually achievable here? You know, diplomacy is rarely a clean, linear process. It's incredibly messy, it's full of contradictions, and it's built on a mountain of mutual distrust. But right now, it is also the only viable way forward. I highly encourage you to keep this framework in your head as the headlines keep developing. Stay curious, look right past all that rapid-fire noise, and keep analyzing the deeper structure of the story. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you all next time.